EVO.
Welcome back to The Devil Within. Before Thomas Eugene Creech became the monster Idaho newspapers would label the Quiet Killer, he was a child, moving through the world with the eerie detachment of someone watching life from a distance. Some killers erupt later in life. Creech simmered from the beginning. Born in 1950 in Ohio, Creech grew up in a household held together by the thin, brittle glue of religious anxiety and emotional neglect. His mother oscillated between stern Bible literalism and cold indifference. His father, when he was present at all, drifted in and out of jobs and marriages like a ghost who refused to commit to any form or duty. The home was strict but unstable, an environment toxic enough to shape a boy into something sharp-edged and hungry for attention. Teachers later recalled him as withdrawn, slightly sullen, and unusually watchful. He rarely spoke in class, but when he did, it came out clipped and oddly formal, as though he were mimicking the rhythm of a human voice rather than using one organically. One elementary school teacher wrote in a behavioral report that, quote, "Child exhibits flat affect, does not respond to positive reinforcement, appears to study others rather than interact with them." These early documents read almost like first case notes of a long-term psychiatric evaluation, except no one stepped in. No counselor, no pastor, no concerned neighbor. Creech slipped through childhood like a shadow, unnoticed until he wanted to be seen. The first hints of darkness came in adolescence, as they often do. Other kids joined sports teams. Creech lingered around the edges of woods behind the schoolyard. Others filled notebooks with doodles. Creech filled his with cryptic phrases and sketches of knives, symbols he would later describe as, quote, proto-satanic, sigils drawn from magazines, comic books, and dime store occult paperbacks. He read obsessively. Not fiction, not adventure novels, but Anton LaVey, Dennis Wheatley, and sensationalist books about witchcraft and demonic possession. Most teens skim that stuff for the thrill, but Creech annotated it. He studied it the way other boys studied football plays. Later in interviews, he would claim that he heard a voice, as early as age 13. A presence he insisted was, quote, the adversary, the dark mentor who would guide him toward his purpose. Now, was that true? Was it delusion? Was it adult manipulation? No psychologist ever formally diagnosed him. No investigator ever proved that he had hallucinations. But Creech leaned into the myth early and often. It was the one thing that made his otherwise empty young life feel extraordinary. There were girlfriends, brief, uneasy relationships. One woman who dated him at age 17 told a Boise reporter in 1980 that he looked at you like he was measuring something, not like a normal teenager, more like a butcher looking at cuts of meat. She broke off the relationship after he brought her, uninvited, to an abandoned church outside Akron, Ohio, where he talked for over an hour about energy power, dark signatures, and dedicated rituals. She described leaving the building feeling like he wanted to use the place for something. Still, Creech didn't erupt into violence immediately. What he did was drift. By 18, he was hitchhiking across the Midwest, taking day labor jobs, stealing food, sleeping in freight cars. And somewhere during these years, he developed a fixation on transient men, loners, drifters, men who simply wouldn't be missed. He began thinking of murder not as a crime, but as a form of ritual purification. In one confession transcript later released by the Idaho Department of Corrections, he stated, "Killing was a way to clear the noise, a way to keep the shadows fed." Now, Investigators would spend decades trying to decipher whether that statement was metaphor, delusion, or a carefully engineered persona meant to make him seem more powerful than he was. The truth likely sits somewhere in between. By his early 20s, Creech was accused of multiple acts of violence: stabbings, beatings, robberies, but he was rarely charged and almost never convicted. Authorities in several states, including Oregon, Idaho, and California, would later admit that the early 1970s patchwork of law enforcement databases made it nearly impossible to track a transient suspect across state lines. And Creech exploited that loophole ruthlessly. When he finally began killing, in earnest and with escalating boldness, he claimed he did so under the influence of a brotherhood, a shadowy cohort of satanic practitioners he insisted operated across the country. He said they issued orders. He said he was initiated in the desert outside Reno, kneeling in a circle of fire under the supervision of men whose faces he never saw. Now, none of this was corroborated, but here's the thing. The world didn't need proof. It needed a story. And Creech, even then, understood the power of a story. While police pieced together his movements, while victims' families begged for justice, Creech fed reporters half-truths wrapped in occult flavor. He knew how to sound like the villain the public feared the most. Still, before he became the, quote, satanic serial killer headlining West Coast newspapers, Thomas Creech was a boy born into neglect, sharpened by isolation, and shaped by a hunger for significance that would eventually warp into something lethal. Violence didn't happen to him all at once. It bloomed in him slowly, like mold spreading through a house that no one ever bothered to clean. One detective who worked the case decades later put it simply: he wasn't born evil, but he sure as hell studied it. And that's where the story truly begins. A child with a hollow center, filling it with shadows and mythology, and the feeling of power that comes from believing you are chosen for darkness. Chapter 2. The Highway Rituals. There's a particular loneliness to American highways, a kind of spiritual ache that settles in the rest stops and gravel turnouts where men like Thomas Creech learned to become invisible. By the early 1970s, Creech was no longer just drifting. He was dissolving. Jobs slipped away. Relationships evaporated. He stopped calling home. He stopped pretending to belong anywhere. And it was on those long, gray stretches between states that Creech's life took the shape of something predatory. Detectives would later describe this period with a phrase that almost seems poetic in its bluntness. Creech began killing the way other men began drinking. The pattern is maddeningly simple. He would hitch a ride with a transient, sometimes a drifter just like him, sometimes a traveling salesman, sometimes a young wanderer trying to outrun his own past. They'd share a cigarette, a can of beer, maybe a couple stories. Then Creech would wait for the moment the world went quiet, a secluded turnout, a forest pull-off, the back edge of a truck stop, and he would strike. His early weapons were whatever he could find: a tire iron, a pocket knife, a discarded hammer from a roadside construction site. Creech was not a creative killer. He was an opportunistic killer. Violence wasn't symbolic at first, it wasn't ritual, it was utilitarian. But later when the press listened, when detectives leaned in, when pastors preached from pulpits about the satanic wanderer crossing our highways, then Creech laced the murders with meaning. He wrapped them in occult language thick enough to terrify anyone who didn't look closely. He told one detective in 1974 that when the circle wants a life, I take a life. That phrase appears nowhere else in any documentation of any actual satanic practice, and yet that one line made its way into newspapers across Idaho, Oregon, and Northern California and was referenced breathlessly by reporters who didn't realize Creech was feeding them exactly what they wanted: a boogeyman shaped like an inverted cross. The first murderer tied conclusively to Creech was the killing of a man named Paul Schrader, a 40-something drifter that he'd been traveling with through California. They'd been seen together at diners and rest areas, just two men on the margins, just blending in. Schrader's body was found near a turnout outside of Sacramento, beaten so severely that early reports misidentified him as possibly the victim of a ritual slaying. And that detail, the possibly, came from a single patrol deputy who'd never seen a body in that condition. But once it appeared in print, the rumor stuck. In Oregon later that year, Creech was linked to the killings of John Wayne Bradford and Edward Thomas Arnold, two friends stabbed repeatedly inside their van. The crime scene had elements that would fuel the satanic rumor mill for decades. The bodies were discovered in unusual positions, as if moved post-mortem. A Bible lay open on the front seat, though it's unclear whether Creech put it there or if it belonged to the victims. But to the investigating deputies, this was simple sloppy staging, a killer trying to confuse the scene. To the newspapers, it was a tableau of ritual overtones. To evangelical watch groups, it was proof that dark forces were moving through Oregon. And Creech did nothing to correct the record. He enjoyed the attention too much. He actually told police the book was open to the chapter I needed. When asked which chapter that was, he smirked and said, "Whichever one scares you the most." So it's difficult to overstate how badly law enforcement wanted clarity in those days. Creech was drifting through states that had no coordinated systems for tracking transient murder suspects. In one of the earliest multi-jurisdictional memos about him, an Oregon investigator wrote, "Subject Creech moves like a ghost. Possible occult fixation, very dangerous." But none of the satanic evidence ever held up. Not in court, not in forensic analysis, not in credible witness testimony. But the pattern became undeniable. Creech chose those isolated victims. He killed quickly, he left inconsistent evidence, and he moved on before any task force could assemble long enough to put his name on their radar. By mid-1974, Creech had crossed into Idaho. It was here that he killed William Joseph Dean, a 40-year-old man who'd offered him a ride near Horseshoe Bend. Dean never stood a chance. Creech stabbed him repeatedly, left the body just out of view of the highway, and he walked away without looking back. This time, though, police caught him. But not because of his mistakes, because he stayed long enough to be seen. A group of teenagers headed home from a fishing trip spotted Creech walking along the road, his shirt stained, his demeanor oddly calm. One of them later said that he looked like a guy who just finished a job that he didn't want to talk about. Officers found Dean's body hours later. Creech, questioned at a nearby gas station, gave contradictory stories, the first cracks in his mythos. But even then, even in that small, fluorescent-lit room with a deputy jotting notes and a humming Coke machine drowning out the silence, Creech reached for that darkness that had inflated his sense of importance all these years. He said Dean had mocked the circle. He said the killing was ordained. He said the Brotherhood required a sacrifice. Of course, none of the officers knew what he meant. Also, none of them believed him. But the words ended up in a report, and the report ended up in a newsroom. And once it was in print, Creech had officially transformed from transient murderer into something far more marketable: a satanic serial killer crossing the American West. And from this point onward, the murders and mythology of Thomas Creech would become nearly inseparable. And Creech, now finally tasting the attention he'd hungered for since childhood, embraced that darkness with both hands, and he would never let it go. Chapter 3. The Devil in the Interrogation Room. The interrogation room at the Ada County Sheriff's Office was one of those small, windowless concrete rectangles that seemed designed less for questioning than for peeling the humanity off the person inside it. Pale walls, mismatched metal chairs, table bolted to the floor. A place where men confessed or lied or unraveled, depending on which part of themselves they'd brought with them. Thomas Creech didn't unravel. He performed. Following his arrest for the Horseshoe Bend murder of William Dean, Creech was brought in wearing a blood-smudged shirt and a distant expression that several deputies later described as hovering somewhere between smug and detached. There was no fear, no indignation, only calculation, the quiet confidence of a man who believed he still held the upper hand. Detective Harold Munson, a veteran with the kind of weary eyes that had seen more horrors than he cared to catalog, he started with softball questions. Where had Creech been traveling from? Did he know the victim? Had anyone else been with him? Creech answered slowly, as though savoring each word. At first, he lied. Small lies, sloppy ones, like a man warming up before a marathon. He claimed, I never met Dean. That blood's from a cut on my own hand. I was camping alone. Munson noted each discrepancy, each omission, the same way a surgeon notes tumor margins before cutting. But then Creech shifted. Something inside him, ego, maybe thrill, theatrics, clicked into place. He leaned back in his chair and said with a faint smile, You want to know why he died? Because the circle demanded it. Now, Munson didn't flinch. He'd heard men invoke God, invoke Satan, angels, demons, whatever cosmic excuse could free them from their guilt. But Creech spoke with the confidence of someone who actually wanted the room to lean in. Creech described a shadowy brotherhood, faceless, nameless, drifting across interstate highways like a fog of malice. He claimed they'd initiated him sometime in the early 70s, under a moonless sky, somewhere between Reno and Salt Lake City. He said there was a fire. He said there were symbols drawn in the desert floor. He said a voice, the voice, had taken hold of him. It was all theater, but Munson just let him talk. A transcript from the interview shows this following very telling exchange. Munson, tell me about this brotherhood. Creech, they're everywhere. Munson, names? Creech, names aren't important. Shadows don't need names. Munson paused for a moment, not because he believed it, but because he recognized something far more dangerous than some alleged occult allegiance. The pleasure Creech took in being believed, even briefly. During one of his later confessions, Creech said, Killing is a sacred practice that you wouldn't understand. Munson replied, Your sacred practice just got you the death penalty. Now that last line never made it into newspapers, but Creech's satanic language did. Reporters seized on the idea of a wandering ritual killer. Evangelical groups seized on the idea that the highways were being used for dark ceremonies. And Creech, sensing the amplification of his own myth, just leaned into it harder. Now, the police, meanwhile, were trying to do the exact opposite. They were scraping through the chaos to find actual victims, actual crime scenes, actual, timelines. They discovered connections to Oregon, California, Texas. It seemed like Creech had been everywhere, which meant the murders could be anywhere. One officer researching Creech's travel patterns wrote in his memo that he may be responsible for up to 40 deaths. Hard to verify idle boasts, but the pattern suggests more victims than we know. Officially, Creech never admitted to a specific number. Sometimes he said 5, sometimes 10. One time he actually said 40. But his answers depended entirely on the audience. After nearly 12 hours in custody, Creech finally asked for a break. He wanted food, he wanted a cigarette, and Munson offered him both. Creech accepted. A moment of human triviality warped by the knowledge that mere hours earlier, the hands now holding a styrofoam cup of coffee had been used to take a man's life. When detectives attempted to extract a clean confession, Creech tightened. contradicted himself. He smirked. He stared at the floor. He said the voices weren't currently speaking, but he did say that the circle would be angry. And he said that he was meant to keep moving. But he slipped. All killers slip. He described Dean's clothing, though police had never mentioned it. He described the exact number of stab wounds. He described the location of the knife he'd thrown into the brush. And that was enough. Not the full confession detectives hoped for, but enough for the district attorney to move forward. And yet, for all the procedural clarity the case began to take on, the public narrative was already mutating. Within days, the newspaper, the Idaho Statesman, printed the words ritualistic overtones. The Oregonian speculated about a satanic cult. On AM radio, the talk show preachers warned listeners to avoid picking up hitchhikers because the devil has taken to the American highways. Thomas Creech, sitting in a cell not 50 feet from where he'd been interrogated, smiled at all the attention. He'd always been invisible. He had had no shape, no voice, no power. And this was the beginning of the transformation, from transient murderer to occult monster. And Creech, ever the student of darkness, embraced his new myth eagerly. He would feed it for decades. That's where part 1 ends, with a drifter in custody, a confession wrapped in occult language, and a community terrified by a story far stranger than the evidence could support. Thomas Creech wasn't just killing people. He was building a mythology, brick by brick, lie by lie, symbol by symbol. But the real horrors, those are still ahead. Next time on The Devil Within, Creech enters the prison system, where the lines between murderer and monster begin to blur. We'll follow him into the bowels of one Idaho penitentiary, track the killing that finally secured him a spot on death row, and watch as religious groups, talk shows, and police investigators turn Thomas Creech into one of the most enduring satanic figures of the American West. If you're enjoying the series, please follow, rate, and review The Devil Within. Your support helps us keep telling stories like this one, the dark ones, the strange ones, the ones that live under your skin long after the credits roll. Visit eviocreative.com for more and follow us on Instagram at The Devil Within Pod and at Evio Creative. Support the great companies that support long-form storytelling. Quince, luxury essentials at honest prices. Quince.com/devilwithin for free shipping and 365-day returns. Mint Mobile, premium wireless for just $15 a month. Go to mintmobile.com/devilwithin. ExpressVPN, protect your data everywhere. ExpressVPN.com/devilwithin for up to 4 months free. And Mood, legal THC and CBD shipped nationwide. Mood.com/devilwithin for 20% off. We'll see you Friday for part 2. Until then, stay safe out there.